Hey, everybody, welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. And today we have returning a good friend and special guest, Mitch Horowitz. Welcome back, Mitch.
Thank you, my man. Good to be here.
And Mitch has written several amazing books, and he has his newest book, Modern Occultism: History, Theory, and Practice, that's launching tomorrow, I believe. Is that right?
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Maybe
and
midnight tonight, depending upon the gods of digital commerce. But yeah, it's out tomorrow,
yeah,
Tuesday the 19th.
and I think people can get that on Amazon, or is there another place that people can get that, or is it Amazon like the?
Oh, just anywhere books are sold. I mean, buy it Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Independence, you name it.
Yeah.
It's available for sale at the Philosophical Research Society bookstore in Los Angeles, where I'm speaking Wednesday night and Friday night of this week. So anywhere you buy books, you can buy this one.
Yeah. And again, it's you did the audio narration for the audiobook version.
Yes.
So people can listen to that and Mitch's powerful voice if they so choose, which I'm gonna get the audio version too, because if I'm on the train, sometimes I need to just sit back and I like my mind is kind of like in a listening mode. I'm going to listen, so people can get that if they like to. And it's really funny that here this is kind of engaging the phenomenon. It's somewhat of a UFO podcast, something of a consciousness podcast, but we cover the broad spectrum of that. And what's interesting is because Mitch, the first time I came across your work, I'm in the bookstore and the UFO section. At the time it was called New Age. Now it's called like Self Transformation or something. At least in
Is that
Barnes and
right?
Noble. Yeah. So I was looking through UFO and consciousness books, and I came across Occult America, and that's how I first came up upon your name many years ago. Now, and so it's funny if you're looking into UFO information, you're gonna inevitably come across the occult and magic and things of that nature. So again, your new book is called Modern Occultism: History, Theory, and Practice. So to preface that a little bit, just for the audience listening, how would you describe the occult?
Well, the occult is a term that grew from the Latin occultus, meaning hidden or secret, and it came into usage during the Renaissance as a way of referring to pre-Christian spirituality of a world that had then disappeared, that belonged to the empires of ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, Persia, and these practices that were polytheistic in nature, seasonal oriented, steeped in divination, deity veneration, sometimes spell casting and other practices for good luck, divining, understanding and navigating the currents of life. These things had all vanished, and as they were being rediscovered, there was no understanding of what to call them. So the term occult or hidden is what was settled upon. And the rebirth of those practices, at least in a very fragmentary form during the Renaissance, is what has turned into what we would consider the modern occult. Occultism nowadays, and this has been true for centuries, is really a revivalist movement, an attempt to rediscover, readapt the ancient spirituality that used to populate the Western world and that vanished in a schism. Ours is, in a certain sense, the only culture of which that's true. If you grew up in India, for example, and you're a Hindu, you belong to a culture that's been continually practiced for millennia. Same is true of Buddhism. Even in China, which is an officially atheistic society, you still have traditions of animism, Taoism, Confucianism. In Japan, Shintoism. You have shamanic practices that run through different cultures around the world. Again, some of these have been in practice for millennia, but we in the West had a very deep and complete schism with our religious past, so that all of the polytheistic traditions that once ran through the Hellenic and Persian worlds, which in the strictest terms I would define as the West, places that were once occupied by the armies of Alexander the Great, they vanished to a very great extent. So today, the threads and the fragments that exist and that are readapted, novelized, changed, we refer to as a cult.
Yeah, this goes without saying. People are going to realize by hearing you talk right now that again, your books are very comprehensive and nuanced, and I really appreciate that. It's not like good and bad, and again, reality is more complex than just the kind of black and white thinking
Right.
and simpleton, like so to speak. It's more nuanced, and I really appreciate that you bring that perspective to this work, because I think it's going to give people a more comprehensive understanding of these that's not so dilated with perspective of one or another. I think
Right. If I may, one of the points I try to make in the book is that there are no good guys and bad guys in this story. In late antiquity, the lingering pagan powers were involved in a struggle for influence and dominance with Christendom, with the early Christian church, and the Christian church obviously prevailed. And winners get to classify losers, especially in matters of religion, however they want. So the fading pagan powers were classified as being maleficent or demonic, ways that they had never even conceived of themselves. In fact, the term demon itself, with its roots in ancient Greek, is really a neutral term for spirit. It's only over the course of centuries that we became conditioned to see it as specifically referring to some kind of an evil spirit. But as I point out in the book, if the situation were reversed, had the pagan powers prevailed, they would have defined Christians according to their own choosing. And certainly there was a history of Christian persecution within ancient Rome, and there's no reason to think that that would have stopped. So it's not who's right, who's wrong, and who's on what team. It's trying to understand human nature and how we got to where we are.
Right. And I don't want to kind of press on people's beliefs. I respect everybody's belief and right to believe whatever tradition or background they come from. But I do appreciate when people have an open mind. And again, the word, demon is really trying to kind of say talk about a highly intelligent spiritual entity, so to
Mhm.
speak. So for what that's worth. Um, but the in a sense, UFOs are occult in the sense that they're hidden,
Yeah.
right? It's like a hidden knowledge almost, and in if we were to take it through the lens of modern occultism, UAP, right? They're being hidden or suppressed, or even their own nature is somewhat elusive at times. Um, so do you if we're going to talk about occultism, um has there been, or was there, or is there a stigmatization of occultism as there is with UFOs or UAP?
Well, the cultural triumph of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, later on Islam, the cultural triumph of those religions, social triumph of those religions, rendered the polytheistic practices of antiquity, what we now call occult, as forbidden, as verboten. These things were unseen or hidden because the temple orders, the religious rites, the mystery traditions to which they had belonged, they were vanished. Egypt was in ruins by the dawn of a Renaissance that had not even heard of its religious traditions that had extended for millennia longer than what we think of as Western culture, post-Christian Western culture. So, we're in a situation where we see the religious practices that once dominated the West relegated to what seems like a pretty permanent outsider status. And people who are deeply interested in the UFO thesis, as I am, as so many of your listeners are, find themselves in a not dissimilar position. Although in another generation, that position may very well change. It may change in less than a generation. Depending on events, human and otherwise, it may change in the near future. We really don't know. But ever since the triumph of the reportage by Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, and Helena Cooper in the New York Times in 2017, I mean, we've seen progress as you well know, on the UFO front that I couldn't have imagined 6, 7 years ago. I mean, simply couldn't have imagined it. Seeing headlines in the Wall Street Journal, giving me the latest updates on UFO wreckage that's being searched for. And, this is the kind of thing that, you would have thought somebody was drunk and we're going to fire the weekend editor. And, it's like, this is normal news coverage at this point. And it continues to be controversial, of course. But the progress is extraordinary. So whether the UFO question remains an outsider question is in flux, and that's incredibly exciting. Things that I also care about, like ESP research, parapsychology, for example, those are borderline sciences, I suppose you could call them. Not a term I'm particularly warm towards, but it reflects the outsider status of parapsychology, search for life after death, search for extra-physical communication. All of these pursuits are very legitimate according to the methods used. Science is nothing other than methodological replication. The materialist culture uses science in terms of religiosity, but that's what it is. It's replicable methodology. We mustn't forget that. So if you're using the terms, the weights and measures of science, then what you're doing can't be relegated to the category of pseudoscience, except on Wikipedia, where pseudoscience will never die. I mean, if Christopher Columbus was alive today, he'd be called a purveyor of pseudoscience on Wikipedia. But leaving that aside, we're in a state of flux with all these things, but leading the charge in the area of change is the UFO thesis, because it's so dominantly felt and held to and experienced by vast numbers of Americans. It's probably the one issue in this nation today that surpasses all political boundaries. So as the UFO thesis continues its march into mainstream study, consideration, scrutiny, it's possible that in its wake some of these other topics will come along too. So I feel very strongly that those of you who have been really rowing the boat in terms of keeping alive the serious inquiry into UFOs, the question of interdimensionality, the question of ET intelligence, and so on, don't neglect to take a victory lap. Don't neglect to take a victory lap, because change is afoot. And that change may ripple through our culture in ways that elevates other queries that have been sidelined for too long.
Well, and that's certainly my hope, Mitch, is that with people being more open-minded and accepting of the UFO reality, with that, which I think is almost more important, or the bigger picture, is getting into things like the nature of reality itself. There's a UFO phenomenon, and there's contact, and there's, within that, we're talking about non-human intelligences, right? Which could be a number of things. We have the current lens, as Jacques Vallée points out, of the alien or extraterrestrial, because that's our contemporary kind of lens of seeing things through technology. When, again, if you go into the occult, there's themes going back, hundreds and thousands of years, for millennia, and a central theme of humans interacting with non-human intelligences, right? And within the occult, there's different rituals and methodologies on how you can do that, and their occult understandings of what these intelligences may be. And so that's a central theme. And again, in the modern day, we would consider that, contact with UFOs, or UAP, non-human intelligences, as even David Grush used that term, non-human intelligence, not to define it in a small box of, say, extraterrestrial intelligence necessarily, in the way that we would understand it. But again, I'm really glad that you pointed out what people call psi or psychic research, or as you've called it, extra-physical, because the UFO programs for decades. The ones that we know about and the ones that we don't know about. So the ones that are still classified, they're called UFO legacy programs, and the ones that are kind of above board, which they called OSAP and ATIP. All of those programs involved some element of psychic research.
Mhm.
And we know that, SRI was studying remote viewing at Project Stargate. They were doing psychic research, and all the remote viewers are not intendedly having psychic encounters with UFOs and UFO occupants.
Mhm.
So that kind of psychic research and UFO studies are very heavily tethered together in one way or another. It just you just can't seem to separate the two.
Yeah.
And with that, the third prong I would say is with those studies is also the occult,
Yeah.
uh, because all of those same themes come up. And if you have something to say to that.
Well, I think part of the reason why these fields are unified, in addition to what you were just referencing, is that modern intellectual culture has not made room, say over the past 150 years, for the search beyond commonly observed physicalism. Maybe I'm going out on too great a limb when I say that, because certainly quantum mechanics, quantum theory encompasses and includes the search for things that go outside ordinary observation. And yet, even the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment, which now goes back to the 1930s, the many worlds theory, which in a sense grew out of the Schrodinger's cat experiment, which was coined more or less in the late 1950s. These ideas that quantum theory open us onto different windows of reality, maybe an interdimensional infinity that's ever present. In fact, it's a logical imperative that such a reality exists. Those questions outside of circles of theoretical physics are still highly controversial, particularly within opinion-making outlets of journalism and academia and reference sources like Wiki. And it's a hole in modernist philosophy that the search for hidden antecedents doesn't extend beyond the physical in most cases. So, for example, if you're a Marxist, the hidden mechanics of life are economics. If you're a Freudian, trauma, as Einstein taught, space-time and relativity, as Louis Pasteur taught germ theory, as William James taught self-image, as Darwin taught orderly biological development of life. None of these theories or ideas are mutually exclusive, but they capture the modernist intellectual quest, which is the search for hidden antecedents. What's under the hood? What's under the hood? That's the modernist question. It's not reasonable that question of what's under the hood excludes the extra physical or potentially the extra human. It's not reasonable if the methodology to conduct that search is sound, that shouldn't be part of modernist intellectual culture, but it is, and it's just a conditioned thought habit. I'm not laying a political trip on anybody, but Marx, who was hugely influential, was ardently materialistic. Freud less so, but in popular literature, Freud is seen as ardently materialistic. And then when Einstein talks about those of us who believe in physics know that there's no such thing as time, there's no such thing as death, people think, well, the old man was just being a poet by that point. Well, he really wasn't. He really meant it very concretely. And Isaac Newton would have also agreed with him. And so we need to make this leap, I believe, in order for modern culture to thrive, to be willing to apply a common standard to the search for reality. And that common standard has to be based in the quality of your research, not whether or not what you're looking for seems far out. That's just a prejudice. If the quality of the search is pursued with excellence, then everything belongs under the hood of modernist philosophy. And that's a real hole in our culture. Modernism has to expand in order to remain relevant, to include the extraphysical, the psychical, and the search for interdimensional or extraterrestrial intelligence.
Right. And, I've said this before, but I think it's worth repeating, is that, I feel like UFOs or UAP are like a bridge between physics and metaphysics.
Yeah.
And again, when I say metaphysics, I don't mean it's beyond understanding. I think it's just our current models and our current lenses are not there yet, and that they will ultimately discover the physics, as we evolve. And for people think we have all the answers, but it's obvious if you look at history, we're going to continue making discoveries as we keep going forward, inevitably. So all our current ideas at some point are going to be looked at as, we're going to move beyond them,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
when I was saying about the, UFOs are a bridge between physics and metaphysics, is that, we have what we could describe as physical objects. They can be tracked on radar. They have biological effects. We can recover pieces of materials, and sometimes what are alleged intact full crafts that are recovered, and they can be chased by pilots, and they can jam radar equipment and all that. Yet they're demonstrating feats that we would consider metaphysical. So even if you have a physical object like the Tic Tac that's going from 50,000 feet down to 20,000 feet or less in less than 1 second, even though we can see it's a physical object, by our current understanding, that's metaphysical because we don't understand the physics of how that's being done. So
Right.
it doesn't have to be all woo-woo and magic for it to be metaphysical. We can see these objects doing these different feats time and time again, and we just don't understand the physics of that. So again, by definition, that is metaphysical. But you can go much further and talk about the telepathy, or what in the Defense Department they call psychotronic effects. All those kinds of things are seen when we're looking at UAP, and they've been documented, and a lot of that is classified. But we've heard about it, and some of it is leaked out, some of it is discussed. But so I think that it's important that we keep an open mind, and actually we can in that sense use the UFO as a catalyst to further our understanding in science, but and so much more, right? Even you can use the UFO as a kind of catalyst for, if you've had a contact experience, self-transformation, and all these other kinds of things. So I think that's important to highlight. But I wanted to ask you, in regards to the occult, because sometimes when I talk about contact and contact work and what people know as CE5 or highest human initiated contact, I sometimes give a disclaimer saying like, hey, be aware of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So in that regard, do you have any kind of general kind of disclaimer for people that are even going to research the occult, study occult, or maybe practice the occult?
That's an interesting question, because 15 years ago, I would have said yes. My disclaimer was that you should have some work of classical ethics at your back, whether it's the Dhammapada or the Beatitudes or the Tao Te Ching, or take your pick, or the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. I no longer feel that way. I believe, quite frankly, in diving into the deep end of the pool, and I understand the issue from both sides, and I've heard and can recite and used to personally issue all the appropriate cautions. Light a candle and pray for love and light, or do whatever you want. But the fact is, I think that those of us who engage in the search, and I'm speaking on a personal level, I would regard anybody as quite fortunate to be able to enlist or be present for some sort of experience that was personally meaningful. And I'm not really down with placing up barriers or guardrails. I guess I believe in diving into the deep end of the pool. There's a certain risk there. There's also a certain risk if I sit in my house all day and watch cartoons. And most of the time, consequences are unexpected, dramatically unexpected, and sometimes reach us through very ordinary channels of life. And in the book, in Modern Occultism, for example, I dedicate a section to the Ouija board. Of course, how can you write a book on the occult and not have a section on the Ouija board? It's like Baskin Robbins running out of vanilla or something. But in any case, I cover a historical episode that now is about 100 years old that goes to the nation of Vietnam. In Vietnam, which in the late 19th, early 20th century, of course, was a French colony, there was a good deal of missionary activity by Catholic missions. And Catholic missionaries translated the Vietnamese language into a phoneticized Latin version with characters and letters that we would recognize. So in the early 1920s, a group of Vietnamese spiritualists discovered that this Latinized version of Vietnamese translated well to the use of the Ouija board. So they began using the Ouija board, and they channeled what they believed were intelligent, disincarnate entities, including the disembodied spirit of the French novelist Victor Hugo, who was himself a habitué of seances. And through this work with the Ouija board in the 1920s, a group of Vietnamese seekers created a new religion called Kybalion, which means religion of the high palace. And the Cao Dai faith was actually first pro-French and sided with French forces until they were defeated in the mid-1950s, and pro-American and sided with American forces until the very, very end of the war, including up through the fall of Saigon in 1975. The Cao Dai religion maintained its own private militia, and they were some of the closest military allies to the French and then to the Americans. And then after the Viet Cong prevailed, the members of the Cao Dai faith had to go underground, and they've since reemerged. And Cao Daism is the third largest religion in Vietnam, following Buddhism and Catholicism. And this was a religion, a modern religion, a new religious movement that emerged through a Ouija board. And of course, if I'm a kind of good little spiritual boy and issue all the correct prerequisites, I'd warn everybody against using a Ouija board. But look, we don't know what's going to happen when people experiment, when they search. I believe in the search as an end, as a justification to itself. And in this case, a very dynamic religion emerged from the Ouija board. I guess, part of how you view this depends on your political outlook, but they sided with the French and then with the Americans till the very end of the war, probably saved some American lives. And none of this would have happened if somebody had come along in a finger-wagging way and said, don't mess around with the portal to the other side, you guys. You don't know what's out there. No, we don't know what's out there. Nor do I know what's out there every morning when I log on to Twitter or Instagram, or when somebody DMs me for something. I'm talking about scary. And it's just a fact of life. It's a fact of life. So I don't want there to be barriers to the search. I want people to succeed in the search. I want them to find something. I want them to feel enlarged by it. And I personally believe that it's one of the very few areas of life that's still private, where our data can't yet be sold. We can't slap a QR code on it, and the day's coming, I'm sure. But right now, the search, intellectual, spiritual, and otherwise, is the sole domain and property and privacy of the individual. And I don't want to chip away at that. I want I want the search to be practiced very freely.
Yeah, and to my own nature, that's kind of how I am, right? I joke around and say, when I was a kid, I was the person who took the paperclip and put it in the electrical socket to see what would happen.
What will happen, right? Well, and
And
what
then,
happened? Here,
is that
obviously.
true? But I no, I mean, again, generally when I dove into all this kind of stuff, there was no question in my mind. I was just going to do it. And I think there's a lot of people, I think it's human nature to some extent. That some people are just seekers, right? They
Yes.
they want to know. And we need people like that. We
Where would we be without them? We'd be in a
Right.
lot of trouble, I suspect.
Yeah, we need people that are going to go beyond the boundaries. And so I think that's that kind of spirit is important. And this could almost sound kind of new thought, or I don't know how you'd want to categorize or classify it, but there's the idea, and my almost like my own experience, and again generally my own nature, how I am typically, is that if you feel that you need protection, that there's an underpinning or a presupposition to that, kind of with
Right.
the energy that saying that you do need it, right? Whereas if you just go into it with that, I don't want to say recklessly, right? But if you go into it without that kind of mindset, you don't need it, kind of thing. I don't know if that's vibing with you, if you know what I'm
Oh,
coming
no,
at.
I think I agree with that. And look, if somebody wants to avail themselves of protection of some sort, do it.
Right,
It's
right.
not my approach. I personally think that the whole black magic, white magic divide is artifice. I think so many of our opposing divides are artifice in a way. I think that they're overwhelmingly persuasive by dint of familiarity, and familiarity can really erode the search. At the same time, if somebody wants to say a certain prayer or undertake a certain ceremony, whether it be for protection or anything else, uh, then do so. Do so. I mean, I just don't want to. I just don't want to see barriers thrown up. And I mean, I'm glad I'm answering this question of yours, responding to this question of yours differently today than I might have in 2005. For
Right.
example, I was on Coast to Coast AM for the first time in 2005. That's why that date pops into my head.
Yeah.
And I answered the question very differently, and my response has changed, um, because that's what I feel. That's what I feel, and my response may change, in another 10 years hence, but that's what I feel. I had the opportunity, um, a couple of weeks ago, to go into a recording studio and re-record my first book, Occult America. When the thing was first issued in 2009, the audio edition was read by an actor. And I really wanted to read it, but I just didn't have the clout at that time to make it happen. So it was a dream come true. And I was able to go into a studio and re-record the thing. And I was a little nervous because I thought to myself, wow, this was my first book. Some of my analysis has changed. Some of my outlook has altered. My perspective has shifted. I wonder how I'll feel. Will I be embarrassed? Will I think, oh God, I can't believe I fucking said that? And there are things I would say and do differently now in that book. There are characters, historical figures who I did not include, who I would include. And someday I may do a version of it with a new introduction to call that out. But as I sat there reading the thing over the course of 3 days, I was very happy with it because I thought, look, this is what I felt, saw, surmised when this thing was published back in 2009. I have changed in areas of emphasis, not in basic core values, not in ideals, but in areas of emphasis and understanding. And yet I feel like it was perfect for who I was and where I was and what my perspective was in 2009. And it's very defensible and I'm proud of it. But the fact that the new book, for example, includes characters and figures and ideas that I didn't think were quite appropriate to the task of studying the occult at that time. I've changed, and I hope that that process continues, not because I'm invested in change for itself, but we as a searching community need to be really careful of orthodoxy and catechism, conditioning, artifice, repetition. It's human nature that no sooner does an individual flee one situation that he or she just recreates it somewhere else. And we, whatever you want to call it, the alternative thought scene, the countercultural scene, whatever it is, there's absolutely nothing that should make us sleep easy at night regarding our own sensitivity to orthodoxies. We as a human community are going to recreate orthodoxies almost automatically. And the only thing we can do is watch for that tendency within ourselves. So I think for the search to be real, we have to really be careful of not getting into that catechistic position, not repeating things that are overwhelmingly persuasive just by dint of familiarity.
Yeah, as it should be. And, I'm probably going to botch this. There's a quote, I believe it was from a Greek philosopher, saying something to the effect of, a man never steps in the same river twice because neither the man nor the river are the same. So to that, I don't remember exactly who it was, but if you Google that quote, you're going to find the actual word for word quote and who said it, and it's a profound understanding, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And
That's the wish, and if the man or the river are the same, then something has died.
Right, exactly. And to that, you had mentioned that this time around you wrote Modern Occultism. There were different people that you had mentioned and different things. So do you want to highlight some of those, maybe those people or traditions, backgrounds, and teachings that were included this time around?
Sure. Some of them were different just by dint of geography. Modern Occultism, Occult America was a book that framed its mission as a study of the American occult. And this is a history. Modern Occultism is a history that's expansive beyond any borders. So there are certain figures that are incredibly important to the occult revival, like the French writer Eliphas Levi, who predated Madame H.P. Blavatsky really as the progenitor and pioneer of the occult revival of the 19th century. It took a Madame Blavatsky to make it all happen. Maybe we could say Eliphas Levi was Elvis and Madame Blavatsky was the Beatles. You needed both. You needed both. And into the 20th century, I pay a lot of attention to Aleister Crowley, for example, who I think did have moments of extraordinary brilliance in his career. Jack Parsons, the occultist who died at a very young age in Southern California, whose legacy I have come to increasingly love and respect. Figures that are associated with the so-called left-hand path, like Anton LaVey, Michael Aquino, movements that are very misunderstood, outsider movements like the Process Church, the Temple of Psychic Youth, Topi. These were extremely, extremely important, innovative voices, without which I think occultism as a modern reconstructionist revivalist movement would have been poorer, would have been stagnant. And some of these figures, like Aquino, for example, who died recently, are very heterodox figures. And Aquino produced a literary output that I think was really just extraordinary. And we only fitfully make room for heterodox figures in our culture when they're dead and gone, and we can regard them from a far away distance, or when they fit in with an intellectual paradigm in such a way that I don't know, maybe they get kind of eulogized or heroized because they were wild, like a Jack Kerouac or an Allen Ginsberg or a William Burroughs, for example, all of whom are in the book, particularly Burroughs. But sometimes we fail or neglect to do that within spiritual culture. And it has to be understood that the search cannot be fuzzy and familiar and comfortable if it's just a continual repackaging of same old, same old. And I think some of these figures and groups that I've mentioned really brought a very vital, vibrant current that needs to be reckoned with to the occult subculture. So those are figures that were not, some of whom are American, were not in occult America, and that was my error. That was my fault. I don't think I was sufficiently appreciative of the intellectual vibrancy that you could find in the work of an Aquino or Anton LaVey, who was more of a performance artist than he was an author, but nonetheless sounded a very important note in the culture, was subtler and shrewder than I understood, certainly, say 20 years ago. And a lot of people don't understand these figures, I think, on the terms that they deserve to be understood in terms of their output and influence. So you find personas and movements like that in the book, some of whom I've written about in detail for the very first time.
Yeah, and you open the book pretty much with Jack Parsons,
Yeah.
and people in kind of modern UFO study may appreciate the inclusion of Jack Parsons because Diana Pasulka noted him in American Cosmic because he was I guess having doing rituals, and there was some kind of, I think, attempt to contact non-human intelligence and non-human entities and bring that information back and create technologies. Or that's how, in American Cosmic, it's kind of referring to how, NASA and the Soviet space programs, these people within NASA and the Soviet and Russian space programs are all basically practicing magicians, practicing occultists, if you want to say it like that. And there are still elements of that that are embedded within NASA and a lot of different space agencies. And I believe that, again, it's an old book. There's probably some information in it that I don't agree with, but, Richard Hoagland wrote a whole book about some of those different occult themes that are within NASA and different space agencies that include like Freemasonry and other occult ideas and philosophies that are regularly practiced, even like the dates that are used for launching and things like that. And it just so happens that in some occult beliefs, one of the themes is a communication with non-human intelligence, and to what degree has that influenced those organizations is a question. And and again, if say maybe if NASA had a UFO legacy program, what would it be can include? So
the thing that everybody, Jack Parsons is almost like a Rorschach.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
People see
Yeah.
what they're looking for in him, and there's a lot there. And a lot of people get interested in Jack because his life for a period of about a decade was just so bizarre, involving Aleister Crowley and L. Ron Hubbard and
right.
all these far out magical operations and so on. And all of that is there, and all of that is true. But the thing that I was touched by most deeply, just on a personal level in Jack's life, is that after he was snookered and ripped off by L. Ron Hubbard, and there were all these dramas and antics, financial and sexual and otherwise, in this group home that they maintained together, Jack had a split with Aleister Crowley, and he had for a time been Crowley's North American deputy protege, but they split, and Jack was set out on his own. And the query that he started to make towards the end of his life, which he died too young to fully pursue was whether magic could be simplified, whether some of these highly complex operations were perhaps replaceable with a much simpler protocol. And that's a question at the heart of my own search today. If we have a warranted belief that the mind possesses extra physical capacities, this is one of the reasons why parapsychology is so important to me. I dedicate a full chapter to that as well in the book. If we have a warranted, informed belief in the extra physical capacities of the psyche, is it possible? Is it possible that the liturgy, the rites, the ritual, the ceremony that we associate with religion, with magic, maybe these things are unnecessary? Maybe these things are artifice that might have proven very useful and necessary at different stages of the human story, but might not be as necessary now. And I think that was a query that William James had very indirectly. Jack articulated that very directly towards the end of his life, but he died in his late 30s. Whether by accident or murder depends upon the eye of the beholder. And he never got to pursue it. But the writing that he produced at that time, some of which I reproduced in the book, was really supple and persuasive. And I wish on so many levels the man had lived, because I think that phase of experiment would have produced interesting fruit and results. And I think those of us today in the 21st century, at least speaking for myself, that's at the heart of my current search. That's at the heart of my search. I'm really interested in simplicity. I value liturgy, ceremony, ritual, symbol, aesthetically, historically, and as a legitimate means to maybe arousing the individual to a supple state. But is it necessary? And so that's something I'm working with. And that was something that Jack was attempting to work with toward the end of his life. And that touched me very much.
Yeah, I'll give you my my unwarranted opinion on that. Is
Please.
that yeah, I think that all rituals, the rites, rituals, and all those processes are catalysts for our attention, focus, belief, and consciousness. I have my own like little equation of attention, plus or times belief. I think belief in the process of what you're doing is incredibly important. And I'll go an extra step and say it's not completely intellectual. I would offer to people that you should look at the work that HeartMath is doing and the state that you are in. So it's like a combination of your thought and your emotion and your communication with the field that we're existing in. Mm-hmm. And that has a participatory effect. To speak to John Wheeler and the Pear Lab, random number generators that were participating in this. And, you could focus your level of participation by the state in which you are in. And of course, that's something you can practice, you can get better at. And there's a much more comprehensive and nuanced discussion beyond that. But just if I were to give it to you in a simple paragraph, that's how I would frame it.
Entirely. I mean, last year I published a book called Daydream Believer, which was my best reckoning with New Thought or mind metaphysics. And a good part of the book was dedicated to explorations like the one that you were just describing. What are the circumstances? What are the common circumstances, if any, that can be identified when something happens? Now, of course, a materialist critic would say, well, Mitch, what you call something is just a confirmation bias. And I challenge that. I challenge that because I think we mustn't get too comfortable throwing those terms around as if they explain every facet of the human experience, from Lao Tzu to Jesus Christ to, Sylvia Plath. That there could be no inquiry into the nature of life outside of credentialed study. But what I will at least credit the social science edifice, and it's important, with giving us certain albeit materialist guardrails for understanding that, We have cognitive prejudices, and those have to be minded as well. But I absolutely will not use the reality of cognitive prejudices as a cudgel to disassemble, discredit the human search, because things occur that can't be calculated on any actuarial table. And when human emotions are involved and there's a congruency between thought and experience, maybe that's what Carl Jung called a synchronicity, that's
Right.
to be taken seriously. That's a very, very basic and important part of human experience. And if there are common factors that we can share or that we identify in our own practice, that's important. That's a record. That's a piece of very, very valuable testimony. So I'm trying to wrestle with all this stuff. I'm trying to wrestle with all this stuff. You know, there was a hope, say 100 years ago, with the New Thought, that religion could be a kind of like a science. There could be a science of belief. So terms like Christian Science and religious science and divine science began to abound, as though if you follow certain protocols, you will have a definite outcome. Well, that's not exactly true in the realm of extraphysicality. In fact, there are different and diffuse outcomes, but that doesn't mean that the extraordinary does not occur. And I can't say that plainly enough. And if there's a way of codifying what seems to contribute to the occurrence of the extraordinary, I want to do that. The great psychical researcher J.B. Rhine made the observation in the early 1930s, which has stood up to time, that hopeful expectancy is a very important circumstance that accompanies the extraordinary. And lo and behold, what else is the trigger within placebo studies than hopeful expectancy? And Rhine saw that in the ESP lab 25 years before the modern field of placebo studies even took shape. So I take these markers very seriously.
Yeah. And you know, and there's again, people again within the CIA and the DIA who had dedicated programs and for decades to this kind of research take it very seriously. Not only were they researching it, it was being used operationally. So let me just for people who again may be skeptical or even curious, right? I mean, take that into consideration, right? It's not something that's just like, oh, all, you know, yeah, it may in some senses purposely be framed in one way to the public because they want to study it in private and utilize it to an advantage. So that's there's also like a strategical element to that. That's just you know, part of human nature. So I'll also put that kind of forward. Same with UFOs. We say, you know, we'll say, oh, Paul, you know, UFOs aren't real. The government will deny it, but we know they're studying it in secret. You know, so
And in public, you know, whether you know,
right. Well, to some degree now, but again, we've had programs for decades studying all of this. And you know, but to the public, they'll have said no, it's not real, blah blah blah. So they can have an advantage above everybody else and not advertise what their advances have been and so on. But okay, so this is a question I have for you, Mitch, that I'm sure a lot of things are going to come to mind, but I know you're really good at boiling things down. So if you could, I mean, you know, summarize your book into one sentence. No, you know, or daydream believer, you know, what could be, say, practical applications to the study and practice of the occult for just say any individual, right? Maybe somebody's just getting into it and they're wondering, could this be practical to me? Or even somebody who's really been invested into it in years and has in their own mind made it very complex, and that creates its own kind of buffer to making it something not easy to use per se, but something that you can apply to your everyday life, which I think is like almost the whole point, right? Like, why wouldn't you apply it in your everyday life? So like a practical application of occult studies and practice.
Well, I would say that we dwell under the experience of a vast array of laws and forces. If there is a tool of causation or selectivity that emerges from the psyche, I think that it would be a terrible disservice not to the individual, not to work with that, not to seek out the question of whether that expands a sense of your human agency and power. You know, quite frankly, we all have things that we want to accomplish in the world, and we have relationships, we have art or expressions such as this podcast that we want to get out into the world. We care very deeply about establishing our sense of selfhood, broadly defined. And if that can be facilitated, strengthened, improved through the practice of some sort of psychical query, magical operation, appeal to greater forces, call it prayer, call it petitioning of deity, what have you. I can't imagine anything that would keep me from that. If someone feels that there's something there, pursue it, follow your instinct. If you feel there's nothing there, then I'm not sure you'd be listening to it, engaging the phenomenon. But if you are, welcome. And you could just regard us as a group of eccentrics, and maybe you're here for the history lesson. You know, there's plenty of that in modern occultism as well. And I would also say, by the way, that I do think practical application is extremely important, but I also believe in the search as an end to itself. Last year, I was in Miami at a tech conference giving a talk on ESP research. And by the way, every third or fourth person who came up to me was into Aleister Crowley. So you can analyze that yourself. But I was surprised. And some were into Neville Goddard, the mind power theorist, who I love so deeply. And I was pleasantly surprised by that. Anyway, because this was not a spiritual conference and it was not a New Age conference. It was a tech conference. And I was pretty surprised. But there was a venture capital guy who came up to me after my talk, and he said, look, I liked your talk, about ESP and such, and I think your problem is, in terms of application, you have an engine that works 10% of the time. And, he's speaking metaphorically in terms of the numbers and all, but I thought that was a valid criticism, because replication can be elusive, even though occurrence is very real, and replication is not always elusive, statistically speaking, but it can be on a day-to-day individual scale. And I thought his criticism was valid, and I told him so. But I also think that fact, whether one agrees with it or dissents from it or is not so sure, that wouldn't deter any working parapsychologist I know, because their wish is to get to the truth, is to crank open that hood and ask what's under the hood. That's why, as I was saying earlier, it's to the poverty of modernist intellectual culture that room is not made for the extra-physical, because that's part of the search for antecedents. And we don't know what we're going to find. We don't know what the practical uses will be. I don't know that I persuaded my venture capitalist friend to invest any money in ESP research, but I told him the truth. And, that's all we've got.
Yeah. And, part of that question is, you can get lost seeking and not so much practice. But I would say if you're working with something and you're practicing it and you're exercising it, eventually you're going to get a handle of it to some extent.
You'll find something. Yeah.
You're going to get a certain feeling of, like, when you, say, if you're a remote viewer, right? Or you're practicing remote viewing or CE5 and contact, whatever like that. Eventually you do it enough times, say you do it 100 times, say you have 10%, right? Say you have a 10% accuracy at first, eventually you're going to get the feeling of what those successes were, and you'll note them. And I think some part of you will intuitively be able to recognize that and then apply that mechanism so you can increase your accuracy and potentially your potential, right? That's just some of my own thinking again, because you're talking about before simplicity, and I get very kind of almost the Zen idea of simplicity, direct, straightforward. Um, while there is, it's almost like the difference of like Samkhya philosophy and Ramana Maharshi, when asked about it before, like all the Vedic kind of knowledge of how the astral body and this realm and that realm, and his answer was like, well, what good is it to dig through the garbage, and saying that you don't need all that for to be, there's a more direct way, and you don't need all the fanciful stuff about it. Of course it can help you in different ways, and it's helped over time, and it's there to feed the intellect, but there's a more direct way in which you don't need all that.
Yeah, I quote Ramana Maharshi in the book, pertaining to an encounter he had with the British American mystic Paul Brunton. And Brunton studied with him for a while, and Brunton said, look, back home in the West, we meditate, but we see very little progress. And Ramana Maharshi said, well, how do you know? Spiritual progress can be very difficult to detect. And I like that answer. It was such a simple exchange, but I like the answer because one just doesn't know, and you don't know the time and place where something might occur to you, or something might occur to somebody with whom you're in a relationship, and they turn around and identify some trait in you that you might not have felt was there. You simply don't know. It's very difficult for us to observe a simple cause and effect in these things, and yet at the same time, I'll contradict myself, because sometimes that cause and effect just appears like boom, and it's absolutely remarkable. And then we get hungry for repetition, and repetition may not be there, and that starts a new branch of questions. But this is the nature of the search, and one has to be very comfortable. As someone said to me years ago, you have to be very comfortable with paradox in the search, and you have to be very comfortable with living with paradox, because you're simply going to encounter it. And I really embrace that.
Yeah. And again, I don't want to harp too much on Zen, but with the Zen, very much dealing with paradox is something that I was able to take away from Zen practice and philosophy. But here I got proof. There's some other things I wanted to get from you, Mitch, that are kind of tangent, so to speak. But you also did I believe it was a documentary or a series on the Kybalion.
Yeah, documentary. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So how do you see the, because this, some people here, not everybody here listening to this is going to be familiar with the Kybalion, and I personally have a few different versions of it.
Mhm.
I like to do that with books that I really like. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, I probably have like 5 or 6 different translations at least. I like to see the different perspectives and what another author has to give to the translation or whatever it may be. But so considering the Kybalion, what, and Kybalion metaphysics and occultism, right? How do you see the Kybalion fitting into modern occultism, if I can phrase it like that?
Sure. I write about the Kybalion in the book. The Kybalion is a 1908 occult text that was attributed to a mysterious trio of authors named Three Initiates. It was written by a New Thought philosopher, lawyer in Chicago named William Walker Atkinson. It was a very prolific and energetic man, very important figure to early 20th century metaphysics, wrote under a lot of pseudonyms. And he basically created the book as a kind of piece of theater, a conceit that it was a commentary on an ancient book of Greek Egyptian wisdom called the Kybalion, which seems to be a Hellenized version of the word Kabbalah, although he never identifies it as such. And it's important to note that it's a novelty that was produced by an acolyte of New Thought, but I believe that particularly from a psychological perspective, it's a really very good sounding of certain hermetic themes, as above, so below, the pairing of opposites, life's continuity along a kind of sliding scale, and some of the possibilities that might be presented by certain of the psycho-spiritual ideas, if I can put it in contemporary terms, that might be identified in late ancient Hermetic literature, and certain insights from New Thought that were dawning and sweeping the Western world in the early 20th century. The book stirs up a lot of emotions. Some people feel it's a kind of imprimatur of seriousness to piss on the Kybalion, which was, as some people feel that it's an imprimatur of seriousness to piss on the secret, as if, somehow we need to demonstrate that I don't put up with any of this garbage. But I'm very interested in popular metaphysical expressions, and the Kybalion is certainly one of them. I think the book has certain insights and value, the very least of which could be said that Atkinson, the author, did a serviceable job of plowing his way through certain turgid Victorian era or just post-Victorian translations of the Hermetica, and setting them down in a way that may have been sensational and dramatic, but actually had moments of poignancy and insight. And I engaged with the book anew a few years ago, and I fell in love with it. And so Ronnie Thomas, our director, and I decided to make this documentary, making an effort to sort of trace the origin of some of the book's themes to late ancient Egyptian culture, and then to interview people in the present who are indirectly working with some of these ideas. And I showed it several weeks ago in Los Angeles, and people really loved it. It was very moving to me to show it on a big screen, but it's available on every platform, at least in North America. You name it: Amazon, iTunes, Google Play, Xbox, Tubi. You can find it just about anywhere.
Yeah, and if we're going to talk about Hermetics, I've come across Hermeticism so many times, on my search, right, seeking just of everything, basically anything metaphysical. I somehow I always end up going back to Hermeticism, right? So what is the relationship between the occult and Hermeticism?
It's a fundamental, vital relationship, and it really begins the book, because the fact is, Hermeticism, as we now call it, was a philosophy that grew out of the scene in Alexandria in the generations immediately following the deaths of Cleopatra and Christ. Ruling class in Egypt at that point, and for several centuries, had been Greek in nature. This was carryover from the invasion by Alexander, and Greek scribes in the city of Alexandria in the late ancient era began to write down aspects of Egyptian esoteric and religious philosophy in the Greek language. And this is what we refer to as Hermetic philosophy, or the Hermetica, so named because many times these Greek scribes affixed the name of Hermes Trismegistus, or thrice greatest Hermes, onto their manuscripts, which was an honorific title that the Greeks used for the Egyptian god of intellect and communication, Thoth. And this Hermetic literature was rediscovered during the Renaissance. In some regards, it arterially ignited the Renaissance, and it's very valuable, although for many hundreds of years was very neglected, because it provides an expository literary record that we Westerners can get our arms around, that contains at least fragments of ideas that were in circulation in the final stages of ancient Egyptian culture. It's very important to remember that we in the West were unable to read hieroglyphs until the early 1800s. After Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, he and some of the naturalists and archaeologists that he brought with him discovered the Rosetta Stone in 1799, which was the first document that allowed us to unlock at least the surface expository meaning of hieroglyphics. And I say this to point out that this material is not available to us modern people in as broad a way as we would like to believe. Hermetic literature, for example, really was neglected by translators until roughly our generation. It's only since the early 1990s that we have the first really serviceable English language translations of Hermetic literature. If you look at Harvard's Loeb Classical Library, which is supposed to be the canonized temple of classical Western thought, there's no Hermetic literature in there, not a thread, because the Hermetic literature, for a variety of reasons that I write about in the book, was thought to be fraudulent or discredited. And it's only been since, I would say, the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, the scholars have begun to acknowledge and kind of restore an Egyptian centrifugal thought force to the heart of the Hermetic literature. In other words, the Hermetica for a long time was considered warmed over Neoplatonist philosophy, wearing an Egyptian costume, not unlike how a lot of people regard a book like Kybalion today. And
Right.
that point of view began to shift dramatically in the 1980s as the locus of Hermetic thought was understood, as we discovered more and more antecedents and correspondences, was understood to represent actual Egyptian thought. Again, fragments of it, not just some sort of, Western costume show, dressing up Plato in a, Sphinx-like headdress or something. So Hermeticism is being newly discovered in our generation, just as Gnosticism is, since the founding of
Yes.
Gnostic scrolls at the end of World War II in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. So
Yeah.
we're
Wow.
almost going through a mini renaissance right now in occult thought. Gnosticism is being rediscovered. Hermeticism is being rediscovered. New astrological texts that haven't been translated, that existed in Greek and Latin, are being translated. So we really are going through a kind of mini occult renaissance right now. So, you guys need to hit the ball out of the park in terms of UFO studies, and it's going to help the rest of us.
And you know what though, with the, I don't want to harp too much on technology, and it's controversial with AI and artificial intelligence. But with the discovery of all these different texts and the ability of artificial intelligence to comb through it all and possibly make better translations or translate things we haven't deciphered yet, crack different languages and things like that. That's a really fascinating idea. But yeah, I wasn't even going to bring up the Gnostic text in the Nag Hammadi library, because there's just again, that's uh, you can consider that a cult, right? But here
Yeah.
there were gospels in there, right? So
Yes, yes. And I want to point out something that your listeners might really groove to. We use these terms today: Hermeticism, Gnosticism, paganism. All of these are modern terms, basically. When these things were first used, either in late antiquity or the early modern era, including sometimes the term occultism, they were not always used in a positive way. They were sometimes epithets. Gnosticism, Hermeticism, paganism, these were words that were used within an academic context, sometimes in a negative way, just like ufology is sometimes used in that negative way today. And now we view the term Gnosticism, very neutral term, Hermeticism, very neutral term. It's just describing an ancient thought school in modern terms, exactly what the term occultism is. And it's not used negatively. So there may be a day where ufology or the equivalent is not used negatively, and nobody even remembers that once upon a time it was. So things do change.
yeah, and it's interesting that any kind of like Freemason or Rosicrucian that I've ever met is familiar with Hermeticism. They're
Yeah.
familiar with Gnosticism, and again all these other, basically with the occult. And Rosicrucianism, I mean, is a very mystical system from what I've gathered. I haven't directly studied it. I've read a few different books on it, and very, very much has what I'm familiar with from Eastern ideas. Um, they're talking about meditation and different practices, astral projection, auras, and all these kind of ideas. So it's interesting to see that in there. I have another term. I don't know if this term is used in a purely academic sense or if there's a different meaning within occultism. Hermeneutics. Are you
Mhm.
familiar with that process?
Sure, study of symbols and deciphering,
Yeah, because there's a version of hermeneutics that I came across via one of my friends that we call Hermes of it's like a process of like revisiting and reanalyzing something
Yes,
and seeing the different perspectives of it. And
yes.
are you familiar with that process?
Yeah, it's not something I've studied, but I'm familiar with it generally.
Yeah, and to me that was fascinating because I've done that, just on my own because that's how I like to re-review things, and you always see a different angle to it. And
Yeah,
one of the
yeah.
ways my friend showed it to me, and there he had some guy, he sent me a video of some guy from some kind of academy giving a lecture about the process, and it was really cool because with maybe the Kybalion or the Tao Te Ching or the Dhammapada or anything, you can almost infinitely revisit it and garner a new insight from it.
Absolutely true. Yeah, yeah. I think that's absolutely true, and I think that's probably a mark of truth in a certain sense that when you can revisit a statement, whether it's couched in art or dialogue or philosophy or some other medium, and you authentically glean something new from it in terms of intimate experience, I suppose that's what we call posterity, and that's why it's so important that we not. I believe that we as a generation of seekers not just get addicted to um, repetition and familiarity.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, Mitch, this is going to come off as an amateur question, but I have to ask it, and I'll kind of qualify it by saying, in even within kind of like modern ufology, there's different, you can say, schools of thought within UFO studies or UAP studies. Some people will kind of laugh this off, but some people will take it very seriously. And whether we use terms like Atlantis and so on, um, again, that word will come with baggage. Um, but more directly speaking to less understood ancient human civilizations
Mhm.
and UFOs and the occult. Um, so just for as per your specialty, the occult. Um, where does Atlantis fit into the occult equation?
Well, it's a. I'll put it to you this way: I see it as a kind of metaphor, an umbrella term that has been used in occult studies for the past several hundred years. Obviously, it has much older roots, going back to Plato and beyond. But it's become a kind of metaphor within occult studies for the search for a prehistoric civilization, we'll say. And I, towards the end of the book, I write about the theses of the now deceased John Anthony West and Robert Schoch regarding water erosion on the oldest portion of the
Right.
Sphinx.
Yeah.
And um, their water erosion thesis would predate the dawn of Egyptian civilization to possibly 10,000 to 7,500 BC. And one of the things I point out in the book is that say what you will, make all the circumstantial rebuttals to that thesis that you want, and there have been plenty, and they are easy to find. No mainstream archaeological authority has ever discredited their specific research. And I can't say that plainly enough. I mean, we in the 21st century and in the 21st century again, we in our culture love to use the word science with this almost inerrant religiosity, as if science is something that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai. It's again, science is methodological replication. And the Shock West thesis on its own terms has never been discredited. That is as plain as day. Now, you won't learn that on Wikipedia. On Wikipedia, you'll get pushback that says not only has it been discredited, it is thoroughly debunked, it's pseudoscience, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, why? Well, because there are contradictory circumstances. There are contradictory circumstances, but no one has discredited the weather erosion thesis itself because no one has ever studied it again, because it's very difficult to fund and receive the licensure necessary to do that kind of study. In fact, it's damn near miraculous that Shock and West got to do it in the first place. But we're now going on decades since Shock first issued his report, and the steps that they tread have not been retread and discredited. They have been argued at from the margins by claiming discontinuity in other areas. And those claims of discontinuity, by the way, are important, but they're not the full story, and they've never discredited or served to address the actual data that Shock has presented. And in the book, I analyze why politically and financially and academically especially, it's not so easy to revisit that data. It sounds easy, but it's very, very difficult. It's never been done. And so people will use Atlantis or Lemuria or some such as a kind of metaphor sometimes for the thesis of a prehistorical civilization. And look, if you want to talk in terms of empiricism, we have a piece of empiricism in the Shock West weather erosion data that simply hasn't been addressed. So I take that seriously, and I write about it in the book as an area of query that I think we're impoverished for having at least not made further inquiry into.
Yeah, I find it fascinating. And, Madame Blavatsky writes about past civilizations, and I find all that fascinating. And it does tie in with the UFO question plenty, because there's plenty of stories of, some of these objects being found in archaeological digs and our ancient past, and possibly in our ancient past that we were in communication or open communication or some kind of interaction with non-human intelligences or UFO intelligence, potentially. So those are all fascinating questions I think we should continue asking. And it's funny, I met Shock at Alex Gray's Hall of Mirrors, or the one he had in upstate New York.
Chapel of Sacred Mirrors.
Yeah, I believe that's it. And it was great. So I got to meet him there. That was, I forget how many years ago that was, but
very friendly.
Yeah, and Alex Gray's work is pretty cool too. So
Alex is terrific.
Yeah,
I want to make one comment, if I may, based on what you were saying about Madame Blavatsky. These are really, well, it's two comments, and they have next to nothing to do with one another. But what the hell? There's a lot of controversy around the ancient civilizations and the different root races that Madame Blavatsky proposed and secret doctrine. And one of the things I point out in the book, that to understand her way of thought, it's really important to understand how deeply steeped in Vedic culture she was at that time.
Right.
We in the West are a little bit familiar with the yogic cycles. We're supposedly in the Kali Yuga right now, and these vast world cycles that run through Vedic philosophy. She was in conversation with those ideas. She had relocated to India by 1878. Secret Doctrine came out about 10 years later, and it's very important to understand how deeply Vedic her thought had gotten at that time. And she was in a kind of exchange with some of these ideas that you find within the Hindu religion. The other thing I want to say is that as far as studying some of the ancient findings and such, nothing to my mind is more noble than an individual who really cares about the search in whatever facet, educating him or herself with just tremendous rigor. For example, if you're excited by the theories in the books of like a Zechariah Stitchin, for example, I mean, I don't mean this to sound glib or offhanded in any way, shape, or form. I would never do that to your listenership or any listenership. Consider studying ancient Sumerian. You know, I mean, ask yourself, am I able to do that? Is that possible? The more that we can rigorously educate ourselves, the richer and deeper and fuller the culture of search will become. Some of this stuff occurs in academia, and academia is very important, but it can't do everything. And there are topics that are verboten in academia that the educated individual has to pursue himself. And there are topics that are kind of inside outside. The UFO thesis is inside outside. Parapsychology is inside outside. There's no reason why the individual cannot seek to be rigorously educated in a certain area. It will really help the search, and it will really give you such a feeling of tremendous freedom and achievement that not everything has to be read or encountered in translation.
Yeah, and I'm gonna do a little segue here because I have, remember you speaking about it, is something that's important for people to take note is the quality of skeptics.
Huh. Boy, do we need good skeptics. I'm putting out a want ad for good skeptics because we need skeptics. William Blake wrote, "Opposition is true friendship." And I need people to push back against me who know what they're talking about. And the intellectual culture of skepticism right now is terribly impoverished. I make allusion to this in Modern Occultism. I have a book, chapter called Science of the Supernatural, and I provide within that a history of parapsychology and also a history of modern skepticism as a profession. I have a piece on Medium on this topic called The Crisis of Professional Skepticism. Skepticism is in a terribly impoverished place right now, and it's weird because, as I often say, culturally, materialism, strict materialism, skepticism, physicalism, it's prevailed. Culturally, it's prevailed in academia, in opinion-shaping media, and reference sources, but intellectually, it has failed. Intellectually, it has failed because it simply doesn't cover the basis of some very basic widely accepted scientific findings in the 21st century, from neuroplasticity to quantum theory to mind-body connections to the most bulletproof research, and there's plenty that's come out of psychical research. Materialism is passé, and it's kind of like a walking corpse, and it's going to be walking for a long time. But intellectually, it fails to cover the bases of life, and that failure can be demonstrated not even requiring reference to far out experiments or theories or ideas, but to things that are, I'm not going to say pedestrian, but that are very widespread and accepted. Like within the field of neuroplasticity, it's been demonstrated that through brain scans, we can see that the sustained holding of a thought, which, by the way, there's no consensus definition of, changes the neural pathways through which electrical impulses travel in your brain. It's literally mind over matter on a biologic level, which is acknowledged by the pioneers of the field. We don't understand it, even as we're marching toward something called artificial intelligence. We don't even understand neuroplasticity. And I'm particularly drawing upon a very elementary example. Okay, no many worlds theory, no Schrodinger's cat,
Right.
no quantum physics. Okay, I know they hate when the New Agers talk quantum physics, so I won't even go there. I'm just going to draw up on pedestrian examples. And materialism, or belief that matter creates itself and everything is a strictly biologic or chemical or well, that's really it. Chemical operation based within commonly observed experience. It's a passé ideology, and it's the ideology clung to and poorly argued for by skeptics. And I don't feel good about that. I want there to be good skeptics, and there are some, very few, but some. And I want there to be skeptics who can say, this is your problem, Mitch, with respect to parapsychology. This is what you're not looking at. This is where you go wrong. This is where your interdimensional thesis gets something wrong. This is where your math is wrong. This is where you've misunderstood something. But it has to be a real challenge, a real challenge, not a clown, not a rodeo clown challenge, which is what they're capable of at this point. No aspersion against rodeo clowns, but it has to be something real, and they're not capable of that as a profession right now. They're spread too thin, they're too shallow, and they're too rigid, and their intellectual gravitas has plummeted. So if you want to read about that, that's in this article. The intellectual crisis of the crisis of professional skepticism, and it's also to some extent in the book. But I think that we need good skeptics. We need agnostics who are going to question, but authentically question, not just argue emotionally or sentimentally for materialism, which essentially is what the skeptics field does today, mostly.
Yeah, I mean, especially in the UFO field, there's a lot of the things that are brought up are nonsensical arguments, and they want to stray away from data, and it's unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean it's very piss poor, when you get Neil deGrasse Tyson, who we all love,
Yeah,
saying,
yeah,
next time you have an abduction story, bring back an ashtray, and it's like, ha ha ha, Neil, well,
yeah,
shame on all the crackpots, but of course it looks past the profound testimony and record, and of course we've lost somebody like John Mack. We've had similar losses in parapsychology. There are days where that old expression, only the good die young, I scratch my head over it. I'm like, I don't know who coined that, but maybe he knew something. But we've lost like a John Mack, who's such a towering intellect. And we have, a Neil deGrasse Tyson, who may be gifted as an astrophysicist, but as a public figure is a glib, to put it kindly, and it doesn't help the culture.
and one of the things that really bothers me about that is he'll repeat on national television something that was
Yeah,
clarified
yeah,
by the Department of Defense in the official UAP report,
of course.
that that the DoD investigated and studied and had the task force. It was not a glitch
Right.
within the technology, and he'll continuously recite that, even though the Department of Defense is saying no, that's not what these cases are.
Right, right.
And
And the now deceased James Randi in the world of parapsychology used to do the exact same thing, repeat things that were knowingly and demonstrably false. And I tell you, man, if I ever catch myself doing that, I really hope I hang it up, because I'm not here to do that. And it's really difficult for the skeptics to understand that there are some of us that are we're all emotional beings, and I have my wishes and I have my commitments, and I'll argue for them. But I hope I'm substantial enough to dance on the grave of my former beliefs if somebody really shows me, that I'm wrong, and I'll change. Skeptics don't believe it when people like me talk that way. They think it's a trick, it's a ruse. Don't listen to him. He's in it for the money, and that's because of a malady of human nature, which is that we project our own values or lack of them onto other people. If Neil deGrasse Tyson was part of this discussion right now, he'd be rolling his eyes, thinking we were using debate tactics.
right,
It's like, oh, these guys with their tricks, I'll show them.
yeah,
He doesn't realize that there are people of actual dedication intellectually, who are not just trying to win an argument.
right, yeah, and with that, do you have any closing words for the audience here?
Well, the thing that I'm really trying right about now in my life, in addition to looking for paths of simplicity, is I'm trying to remain flexible in certain precincts of my thinking. I think I've been obstinate, sometimes in the past towards certain theses and ideas, and I'm just trying to remain flexible and be open to why people think and understand certain things, even if I disagree with them, even if I say, look, I'm not sure I agree with your thesis here, but it might be a metaphor for something else that's real, that's actually going on, that I really need to care about. So it's funny. I'm not sure that there's any such thing as common sense. I'm not sure that there's any such thing as a open mind, although we all claim the garlands of both. But I am attempting flexibility, and for whatever it's worth, anybody who wants to, join me, the water's fine.
And where can people find all your work?
Well, my books are available anywhere. Modern Occultism is on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, indie stores, you name it. The thing is out tomorrow, print, digital, audio, and I've worked very hard on it. And I think historically, I've done everything I possibly can to make it a elucidating journey, literally from Cleopatra up through chaos magic and other modern practices. And if it sounds appealing, I hope you'll support the book.
Yeah, and again, I always enjoy talking with you, Mitch. Your work and your lectures, everything you do is nuanced and comprehensive, and fair, right? So I really appreciate everything you bring to your work and to all of us. So thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to speaking to you soon.
Always. Thank you, my man.
Take care.
Take care.